The average price for a new vehicle in the US is now above $50,000 for the first time ever, according to Kelley Blue Book, which noted the all-time high pricing has not stopped electric vehicle sales from soaring. Average transaction prices for new vehicles hit $50,080 in September, the report released Monday found, rising 2.1% from August and 3.6% year over year.
U.S. consumers are about to learn a hard truth. When Washington tears up decades of auto cooperation with Canada, the bill doesn't land in Ottawa, it lands right in American driveways. Prices are rising, supply chains are buckling, and the era of seamless North American auto production is slipping away. And the twist that no one expected is that Canada may emerge from this disruption in a far stronger position than many imagined. Today, we break down the fallout of the collapsing auto pact, why Americans are paying more for their vehicles, why Donald Trump's tariff strategy is backfiring, and how Canada is quietly positioning itself as the stable center of gravity in a fractured North American market. In early 2025, President Donald Trump pushed forward with a sweeping series of tariffs on imported vehicles and auto parts coming from Canada and Mexico. Verified by Reuters reporting, the White House framed the move as a jobs-first reshoring strategy meant to force automakers to expand domestic production inside the United States. But instead of boosting American factories, the tariffs detonated a supply chain crisis that ripped through a deeply integrated industry. For decades, a car assembled in Ontario might rely on engines from Michigan, sensors from Mexico, transmissions cast in Windsor, and software coded in Waterloo. These components crossed borders multiple times before a finished car ever reached a dealership. It was an ecosystem built on efficiency, trust, and open borders. Trump's tariff wall shattered that ecosystem in an instant. Parts that once flowed effortlessly are now slowed by inspections, duties, and unpredictable cost surges. U.S. factories that depend on Canadian-made components are scaling back shifts. Automakers warned that Americans could soon pay $5,000 to $15,000 more for certain vehicles, a figure widely cited in Bloomberg and Reuters industry analysis. Meanwhile, Ottawa's reaction was swift and strategic. Prime Minister Mark Carney announced that the tariffs mark the end of deep economic integration with the United States, signaling that Canada is no longer willing to accept instability as the price of partnership. The auto pact didn't just weaken, it effectively collapsed.
The consequences inside the United States are hitting faster and harder than Washington expected. Prices on dealership lots are rising. Inventories are thinning out as factories struggle to secure the Canadian and Mexican components they relied on for decades. Even companies considered resilient, like Tesla and Ford, now acknowledge higher production costs tied directly to cross-border disruption. The irony is glaring. Tariffs were supposed to protect American auto workers, yet the bottlenecks they created are causing slowdowns and potential layoffs. Confidential industry briefings referenced by Reuters show a quiet admission across Detroit. The Canadian supply chain cannot be reproduced overnight. Replacing it with purely domestic inputs is not realistic without billions in new investment and many years of rebuilding. In other words, the United States engineered a crisis it was never prepared to manage. And within Washington, there is growing recognition that this approach has boxed America in. Lawmakers privately concede the U.S. overestimated its capacity to go it alone while underestimating Canada's central role in advanced manufacturing. The result is a political narrative collapsing under economic reality.
Canada's response stands in stark contrast. Rather than panic, the Carney government treated the crisis as an opportunity to pivot. Ottawa accelerated trade diversification, expanding negotiations with Europe, Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN to open new markets for Canadian auto parts and EV technologies. At the same time, Canada rolled out powerful industrial incentives, including clean manufacturing tax credits, productivity superdeductions, and fast-track approvals for large-scale battery and critical mineral projects. The message to global automakers was simple. If you need stability, predictability, and access to clean energy, Canada is the place to build. While the U.S. is tied up in constitutional lawsuits over Trump's emergency tariff powers, Canada is offering certainty, and global automakers are paying attention. Several are now reevaluating long-term North American investment plans, asking, for the first time in decades, whether Canada is the safer and more profitable bet. Executives visiting Ottawa in recent months have described Canada as the Switzerland of North American manufacturing, a jurisdiction where policy doesn't swing wildly with every election cycle. That perception alone is shifting billions in future capital allocation. This isn't just a trade story, it's a geopolitical shift. For years, Washington assumed Canada needed the United States more than the United States needed Canada. But the supply chain chaos triggered by the tariffs has revealed the opposite. American manufacturing is deeply dependent on Canadian engineering, minerals, and components. Canada, meanwhile, has options. With deepening ties to South Korea, Japan, the EU, and emerging Indo-Pacific partners, confirmed by multiple analyses across CBC and Reuters, Ottawa is designing a new economic architecture that is less reliant on America's political mood swings. Trump may have intended to pressure Canada into concessions, but the result is that Canada is now accelerating its path toward independence and diversification. The fundamental reason American buyers feel the consequences more sharply is structural. U.S. consumers purchase more imported vehicles per capita than Canadians, and U.S. automakers depend more heavily on Canadian components than the reverse. Canada's diversified export network gives it room to maneuver, while U.S. buyers are locked into a market suddenly constrained by tariffs. And where Ottawa has responded with coordinated policy action, Washington's approach has been reactive, fragmented, and politically volatile. In short, when the Auto Pact breaks, Canada shifts sideways. The United States gets hit head-on. What we are witnessing is the flipping of a long-standing assumption. For decades, the U.S. believed it held all the leverage in North American manufacturing. Yet, as supply chains fracture and prices soar, it is Canada, with its minerals, clean energy, advanced manufacturing, and global trade links, that now looks like the indispensable partner. By deepening alliances with the Indo-Pacific and the EU, and by securing new industrial investments, Canada is no longer reacting to U.S. decisions. It is charting its own path. Trump's tariffs were meant to strengthen America's hand. Instead, they strengthened Canada's resolve. The fallout from the collapsing Auto Pact is more than an economic disruption. It is a strategic turning point. American consumers are paying higher prices, U.S. factories are scrambling for parts, and Canada, long seen as the junior partner in the North American auto economy, is now emerging as a stable, credible, and increasingly influential player. As we move closer to the 2026 USMCA review, one question now hangs over the continent. If this is what happens when the U.S. chooses confrontation, what happens when Canada finally decides it no longer needs to play by America's script?
More than 300 South Korean workers were detained during that raid, suspected of living and working in the U.S. illegally.
Well, this is a low point right now in at least recent U.S.-South Korea relations. And really, relations are hugely important, we know.
From the perspective of companies, they will be concerned about disadvantageous treatment or facing difficulties when they're building factories in the United States. That could probably have a significant impact on direct investment in the U.S. in the future.
Hyundai could choose Canada for its next major North American plant, and this is far from impossible. In fact, after the chaos unleashed by the mass deportation raid in Georgia, Canada suddenly looks like the safer, more predictable, and more strategically aligned partner for South Korea's flagship automaker. What only months ago seemed like a U.S.-centered expansion plan is now being quietly reevaluated. Hyundai's confidence in the United States was shaken, Seoul was embarrassed, and investors across Asia started asking how long they can continue tolerating the political volatility Trump has reintroduced into America's economic landscape. In this moment of uncertainty, Canada is no longer a secondary option. It is emerging as a serious contender. The turning point came in September 2025, when U.S. immigration authorities surged into the Hyundai LG battery plant in Elabel, Georgia, arresting almost 500 workers in what authorities called the largest industrial raid in modern American history. Overnight, a multi-billion-dollar clean energy project was thrown into paralysis. Construction stopped. Timelines evaporated. Hyundai's leadership was blindsided, and the South Korean government demanded immediate explanations from Washington. Hyundai described the event as shocking. LG Energy Solution called it disruptive and destabilizing. Reuters noted that several Korean corporations were now reconsidering their risk exposure inside the United States, especially in industries requiring large, specialized workforces. While this chaos unfolded, Canada was demonstrating a very different posture. At the APEC summit in Gyeongju, Prime Minister Mark Carney held substantive talks with South Korean President Lee Jae-myung. The two leaders reaffirmed their cooperation in energy, technology, defense, supply chains, and critical minerals. They signed a new security and defense cooperation partnership, an unprecedented step for Canada's engagement with Korea. At the exact moment the U.S. was breaking trust with Seoul, Canada was strengthening it.
For decades, Hyundai's North American strategy revolved around the United States. The market was huge, incentives were attractive, and political conditions appeared stable enough to justify long-term investment. But that calculation changed in Trump's second term. Tariffs fluctuate without consistency. Immigration enforcement is unpredictable, and supply chains can be disrupted not by economic conditions, but by political theatrics. Hyundai's experience in Georgia has made one thing clear: the United States can no longer guarantee the stable environment a multi-billion-dollar plant requires. Every year the risk grows, and the confidence that once anchored foreign investment is nowhere near what it used to be. Canada, by contrast, can offer exactly what the U.S. no longer can. Carney's government operates through consistent industrial strategy. Regulations are transparent. Immigration is treated as a strength, not a political weapon. And Canada's long-term emphasis on skilled labor, clean energy, and predictable policy gives investors something rare in North America: peace of mind.
We have what the world wants. Take on the energy side, we are an energy superpower. Our top 5 in 10 of the world's most important critical minerals. We are a leading developer of AI. We have the resources the world needs. We have the talent to turn that potential into growth. We're a reliable partner. We're connected more than anyone else through trading relationships with any other part of the world.
Canada also brings real industrial capacity to the table. Ontario remains one of the most sophisticated auto manufacturing regions in the world, supported by decades of experience building vehicles for global brands. Its supplier networks, labor force, and logistical infrastructure are already integrated with global automakers. A Hyundai plant would plug seamlessly into this ecosystem. There is also the mineral advantage. Canada holds massive reserves of nickel, cobalt, copper, and lithium, the very resources required for EV batteries. At a time when the world is scrambling for secure and friendly supply chains, Canada offers Hyundai a natural, legally stable, geopolitically aligned source of battery materials. In that sense, Canada is not just an alternative to the U.S., it is a better aligned long-term fit. Diplomacy matters deeply in industries where supply chains stretch across continents. And here, the difference between Ottawa and Washington is stark. At APEC, Trump declined to meet Carney. Carney responded by meeting Xi Jinping, Lee Jae-myung, and several Indo-Pacific leaders shaping the future of energy and manufacturing. His approach signaled that Canada is not operating in America's shadow. It is charting its own path. For Korea, Carney's tone mattered. It showed respect, predictability, and long-term alignment. When set against Trump's increasingly unpredictable rhetoric and punitive actions, Canada appeared calm and cooperative, two qualities Hyundai now values more than ever. Only a year ago, the idea of Hyundai opening a major plant in Canada seemed unrealistic. But after the Georgia raid, the logic shifted. Canada has the talent, It has the minerals. It has trade agreements that eliminate friction. It has political stability. It has a government focused on Asia, not hostile to it. And, unlike in the U.S., Hyundai would not need to worry about its workforce being detained on camera during a morning police sweep. What was once a hypothetical scenario now feels entirely plausible. If Hyundai announced that its next major EV or battery plant would be in Canada, the impact would be immediate and enormous. Economists would expect thousands of direct jobs and many more indirect positions across logistics, metals, minerals, parts manufacturing, research, and regional development. Provinces like Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, and British Columbia would compete aggressively for it, offering land, workforce guarantees, and incentives. Diplomatically, the symbolism would be even sharper. A major South Korean automaker shifting expansion from the U.S. to Canada would signal that American political risk is no longer tolerable. Other global manufacturers, Japanese, European, or Southeast Asian, would notice. They would begin running their own calculations, and Washington would find itself facing the consequences of its own unpredictability. For the U.S., this would not just be an economic loss, it would be a reputational blow. And for South Korea, it would mark the moment its corporations finally stopped absorbing the cost of American political chaos. And beyond the immediate numbers, the long-term implications could be transformational. A Hyundai plant would anchor new supply chain corridors, stimulate mining development in Canada's northern regions, and accelerate domestic battery research. It could also trigger a wave of follow-up investment from Korean suppliers, companies that traditionally cluster around Hyundai wherever it sets up shop. In effect, one decision from Hyundai could reshape Canada's entire industrial landscape for a generation, making the country a true North American manufacturing pillar rather than a peripheral player. Hyundai never wanted to rethink its North American strategy, but the United States forced that reconsideration upon them. The mass deportation raid cracked the foundation of trust. The inconsistent tariffs widened that crack, and every politically motivated enforcement action pushed Hyundai a little further away. Canada, meanwhile, has quietly positioned itself as the rational alternative, stable, predictable, globally connected, and diplomatically respectful. So now the question is simple. If Hyundai must choose between Trump's volatility and Carney's stability, why wouldn't it choose Canada? This is no longer unthinkable. This is increasingly logical, and it may soon become reality.
We begin with news today that the federal government and Alberta seem to be moving closer to a deal that could include the possibility of a BC oil pipeline.
I'm told by a senior government official that, of course, the number one demand of Alberta all along has been a new oil pipeline to northwest British Columbia. I'm told Carney is open to the idea of actually moving forward on this project, and there could be some language in that MOU that actually suggests there's a path forward, that they could maybe lay out how they could get to construction on this pipeline.
Canada just took a step that rewrites its entire energy future. With new C5 nation-building powers, Ottawa is now prepared to grant tanker exemptions on the North Coast, a move that would have been politically unthinkable under Justin Trudeau. And with that single decision, Canada has opened the door for a brand new Alberta to Pacific pipeline that could send Canadian oil directly to Asia, bypassing the United States for the first time in modern history. What we're witnessing is Canada breaking free of old taboos and acting like the energy superpower it has always claimed to be.
Yeah, we're learning that Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Daniel Smith are moving closer to a deal, a grand bargain, if you will, on the province's energy sector. The deal could be in hand in a matter of days, frankly. Both sides are feeling quite positive about where things are at this point in time. They want to have an MOU specifically on what it means for the oil patch and what it can do, what the feds can do to help maybe expand oil exports.
Over the past several days, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith have moved unexpectedly close to a memorandum of understanding that could reshape Canada's energy map. The two governments are finalizing a framework that would allow construction of a new pipeline toward the northwest coast of British Columbia, something that has been blocked for years. The breakthrough comes from a broader bargain. Ottawa is willing to consider exemptions to the tanker ban that has locked the north coast since 2019. In exchange, Alberta is being asked to commit to long-term industrial carbon pricing and support for carbon capture infrastructure. This is not a single policy shift, but an entire recalibration of the federal-provincial relationship. For the first time in more than a decade, Alberta and Ottawa are moving in the same direction, and both sides appear confident they are within reach of a deal. British Columbia remains the major obstacle. Its government has signaled deep concerns, and Indigenous consultation will be extensive. Several Liberal MPs from coastal ridings have voiced hesitation as well. But the fact remains, Ottawa is now willing to pursue a Pacific corridor, something that federal politics had long treated as off-limits.
The tanker ban was once treated as untouchable, a permanent wall between Alberta's landlocked oil and the world's fastest-growing energy markets. Under Trudeau, it was more than a policy. It was a political identity. But Mark Carney is governing with a different vision. Instead of clinging to symbolic gestures, he is leaning on C5, the new nation-building legislation that gives Ottawa authority to advance projects of strategic national significance. Exempting tankers under C5 isn't a rejection of environmental values, it's a recognition that a mature country can protect its coastlines while still building the infrastructure needed to sustain a modern economy. Canada is not abandoning environmental commitments, it is abandoning paralysis. That is a crucial difference and a sign that Canada is finally learning how to balance energy security with climate ambition.
The possibility of a Pacific pipeline is transformative because it gives Canada something it has never had: direct access to Asia without going through the United States. For decades, Washington has benefited from a near monopoly on Canadian heavy crude. U.S. refineries are literally built for it. Even now, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, almost 70% of America's imported crude comes from Canada. That dependency has given the U.S. enormous leverage that Donald Trump has tried to weaponize through tariffs, threats, and political pressure. A pipeline to the Pacific would break that reliance. It would open the Asian market, one that is expanding far faster than America's, and give Canada bargaining power it has never enjoyed. The mere possibility already shifts the balance. It signals to global investors that Canada is no longer content to be a captive supplier to a single customer. Perhaps the most surprising development is the tone from Alberta. After years of antagonism under the Trudeau government, Danielle Smith now describes the relationship with Ottawa as remarkably aligned. Her government believes Carney understands the urgency of unlocking Alberta's resources and the political pressures of Western alienation. That alignment is no small feat. It shows that Carney is not governing as an ideologue, but as a deal-maker, someone willing to negotiate, adapt, and deliver results that work for both energy and climate policy. This collaboration suggests a new model of federalism, one where Ottawa doesn't dictate from above and provinces don't retreat into isolation. Instead, both recognize that Canada needs national-scale infrastructure if it wants national-scale prosperity. British Columbia remains the most unpredictable part of this story. Its government is deeply protective of the North Coast, and its political base has long opposed tanker activity. Many Indigenous nations in the region also remain skeptical. Their voice will be essential legally and ethically. But even here, the political landscape is shifting. Under C5, Ottawa is asserting that national interest doesn't have to come at the expense of local protection. A case-by-case exemption model forces a conversation rooted not in ideology, but in practicality. BC may still resist, but the discussion has moved beyond a simple yes or no. That alone is a dramatic departure from the past decade. This is the part Washington didn't expect. A Canada with two export corridors, one south, one west, is a Canada that cannot be pressured by tariffs or political theatrics. Trump's strategy of treating Canada as an economic junior partner becomes far less effective if Canada has alternative markets. For years, American officials assumed Canada had no choice but to play by U.S. rules. A Pacific route proves otherwise. The geopolitical implications are enormous. If Canada can export directly to Japan, South Korea, India, or other Asian consumers, it becomes a global player rather than a continental supplier. And the U.S. loses one of its most reliable pressure points. The bigger picture is not about one pipeline or one exemption. It's about a country demonstrating that it understands its own power. Canada is acting with a level of strategic maturity that has been absent from its energy policy for years. It is showing investors that it is ready to build. It is showing allies that it is ready to compete. And it is showing the United States that friendship does not require one-sided dependence. This is the beginning of a new era in Canadian energy, one defined by confidence rather than caution. Canada has crossed a psychological threshold. By opening the door to tanker exemptions and entertaining a Pacific pipeline, the Carney government has moved the country into a new strategic position. Canada is no longer frozen by its own taboos. It is no longer trapped by a single export route. It is no longer content to let other nations, even the United States, define its limitations. The question now is whether Canada will seize this moment fully or retreat into old habits. The next decisions will determine whether this becomes a turning point or a missed opportunity. But one thing is certain: Washington is paying attention, and so is the rest of the world.
While President Trump makes progress on trade in Asia, he is currently icing out America's neighbor to the north, announcing an additional 10% tariff on Canada, apparently irked by a TV ad paid for by the Canadian province of Ontario, an ad that ran on U.S. TV network.
Furious Canada just hit back at Donald Trump in a way no one saw coming. The U.S. president exploded over an anti-tariff ad that went viral across America. He slapped a new 10% tariff on Canadian goods. It was meant as punishment, but Ontario Premier Doug Ford did not apologize. He called the ad the most successful campaign in North American history.
Do you have any regrets about stirring the pot, possibly making things harder on your fellow Canadians due to this retaliation from President Trump?
No, I don't believe so. The person that started this whole thing around the world, not just with Canada, is President Trump. And the American people are finally feeling the effects of tariffs.
While Trump lashed out, Ford stood firm. Instead of retreating, he used the moment to tell Americans that tariffs on Canada are really taxes on themselves. In a few sentences, Ford turned a trade dispute into a public reckoning, and this time the political punch came from the North. Ford's message was simple but devastating. He reminded Americans that protectionism always backfires. He pointed to hard numbers, not political slogans. Over the past 5 months, U.S. manufacturing employment had fallen steadily, while inflation climbed above 4%, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Those are the exact indicators Trump once promised to fix. Ford's campaign wasn't about insults or theater. It was a calculated move to speak directly to American households who now feel the cost of Trump's tariffs every time they shop or fill up their tanks. And the method was brilliant. By borrowing words once spoken by Ronald Reagan in 1987, Ford used a conservative icon's own warning to expose the danger of Trump's policy. What began as a television spot became a statement of economic logic. When the United States taxes its closest trading partner, it is its own workers who pay first. Trump's response only magnified Ford's message. His outburst gave the Ontario campaign a reach no advertising budget could ever buy. The ad ran during the World Series, but the real audience came afterward when American media replayed the story across primetime. By morning, headlines across CNN, Reuters, and Politico called the video a direct challenge to Trump's trade agenda. The more the president tried to silence the message, the louder it echoed. Inside the White House, officials framed the new tariff as necessary protection. Outside, economists called it self-inflicted damage. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce warned that the latest duties could slow factory activity across the Midwest, especially in states like Michigan and Ohio that depend on cross-border supply chains. What Trump meant as a show of strength became proof of his vulnerability. Canada and the United States are not just neighbors. Their economies are literally built into one another. Every day, roughly $2 billion in goods cross the border, according to Statistics Canada. Car parts move from Windsor to Detroit, then back again for final assembly. Ontario steel feeds factories in Illinois, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. When tariffs disrupt that cycle, American plants face higher input costs. A study by the Peterson Institute for International Economics found that each 10% tariff on metal imports adds nearly $300 to the average cost of an American-made vehicle. Multiply that across the entire auto sector, and the result is thousands of layoffs, not job gains. Ford's warning now looks prophetic. By trying to punish Canada, Trump is punishing the very workers he promised to defend. In a globalized supply chain, there is no such thing as a one-sided victory. Every tariff creates collateral damage, and this time, most of that damage is landing inside U.S. borders. Imagine what would happen if Canada decided to step back. Without Canadian nickel, aluminum, potash, and uranium, American factories and farms would feel the shock almost overnight. Data from Natural Resources Canada show that the United States buys more than 60% of Canada's nickel and 75% of its potash output. These are materials essential to manufacturing, energy, and agriculture. If that flow slows or stops, prices in the U.S. surge and production timelines stretch. Detroit's assembly lines would stall within weeks. American farmers would face fertilizer shortages just as harvest season peaks. Importing replacements from Asia would take months and cost far more. Canada doesn't need to threaten retaliation. The structure of the North American economy is already its shield. Ford's calm but defiant stance reminded everyone that Canada's strength lies in its reliability, and removing that reliability is the one thing the U.S. can't afford. After the controversy exploded, Prime Minister Mark Carney chose a measured tone. He paused the Ontario campaign to reopen trade talks, signaling that Canada still values stability over spectacle. But Ford held his line. He said no one could demand that Ontario stay silent while local jobs were at risk. The two approaches may look different, but they work in tandem. Carney plays the diplomat, keeping doors open in Washington. Ford plays the fighter, showing that Canada won't be bullied. Together, they form a strategy that combines restraint with resolve. While the United States is divided between outrage and defense, Canada is showing something rare: coordination under pressure. In this standoff, it is the quieter country acting with the louder purpose. Ford's viral campaign sent more than a message to Trump. It sent a warning to every policymaker in Washington. Canada is not a sidekick in North American trade. It is an essential partner that powers the U.S. economy, from energy to autos to agriculture. If Washington continues to weaponize tariffs against allies, it risks driving those allies toward new partnerships. Already, Ottawa is deepening trade with Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN nations, exploring alternative routes that reduce its dependence on the U.S. market. Trump's second term was meant to restore American dominance, but every new tariff pushes the U.S. further into isolation. America First is quietly becoming America alone. The question now is not whether Canada can adapt, it already is, but whether the U.S. can survive without the stability that partnership brings. In just a few days, a 60-second ad from Ontario transformed a policy debate into a moment of truth for the entire continent. It showed that words, when backed by data and conviction, can shake even the most powerful office in the world. Canada's response was not loud or angry. It was measured, factual, and unmistakably firm. Trump may hold the pen that signs tariffs, but Ford now holds the story that defines them. The irony is clear. A campaign meant to defend America's economy has ended up exposing its dependence on the very neighbor it tried to punish. Ford didn't need to shout or threaten. He just told the truth. and that truth hit harder than any tariff could. In this trade war, Canada didn't throw the first punch, but when it did, it landed perfectly.